Subcommittee will come to order, and good afternoon, everybody. And thank you for joining us today for a second in a series of hearings on the Trafficking in Persons Report and U.S. efforts to combat human trafficking. In April, our subcommittee took a close look at the records of 6 countries which had exhausted all of their allotted time on the Tier 2 watch list and must, by law, move to either Tier 2 or Tier 3 in this year's Trafficking in Persons Report. One of those who testified was Ambassador Lucy DeBacca's predecessor in the job, Mark Lagon, and we heard very, I think, insightful testimony about why countries, including China, Russia, and Uzbekistan, ought to have been put on Tier 3. An upgrade to Tier 2 would have been completely unmerited and would have damaged the credibility of the Trafficking in Persons Report. The TIP report that was released late last month, however, I'm pleased to say, is one of the best, and that it faithfully reported and graded the records of China, Russia, and Uzbekistan, which had been skirting accountability for far too long. Now the administration is faced with next steps, including what sanctions might be imposed to press these nations to reform. When I wrote the law, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, that created not only this report, but also the Office to Combat and Monitor Trafficking in Persons and Mr. Ambassador Lucy DeBacca's position in the U.S. Department of State, and several other provisions to prevent both sex and labor trafficking, to protect victims and prosecute traffickers, it was sincerely hoped that this report will become the international gold standard and primary means of anti-trafficking accountability around the world. I'm happy to say it has. From the halls of parliaments globally to police stations in remote corners of the world, this report is today being used to focus anti-trafficking, a searchlight on the work that is occurring or not occurring in some 186 countries. But with the power of this report to improve situations came the risk that it could also be used to whitewash the truth about a country's trafficking record. It could fail to report accurately and inadvertently give cover to negligent or complicit governments. I'm very happy to say that the 2013 report is one of the best ever produced. Special thanks are especially in order for Ambassador Louis C. DeBacca and his very dedicated staff for faithfully highlighting the good while exposing the bad and the ugly. The TIP report is faithful and reflects the hard, meticulous work and leadership of the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons. This office not only analyzes whether a country is complying with the minimum standards for the elimination of human trafficking, but also sets specific recommendations as to how that country can move forward. With this report, countries should have no question whatsoever about where they rank as well as how they can improve. Many countries have publicly or privately credited the report as an impetus for real improvement in their trafficking laws and policies. Since the TIP report inception, more than 133 countries have enacted anti-trafficking laws, and many countries have taken other steps required to significantly raise their tier earnings. I just returned from Istanbul on Saturday for the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly and offered a resolution there on trafficking and especially some of the best practices that Ambassador DeBacca and I have been talking about, and where flight attendants can be trained as to how to spot a trafficking as it occurs while that woman or women or victims are being moved and transported. Not only did it pass unanimously, but many of the heads of delegation have made it very clear that they're going to go back to their capitals and take up that idea. I also talked to many of the heads of delegation and members of parliaments about the TIP report. Many of them knew about it. Some of them were unhappy that our country takes it upon itself to hold them accountable. But as I told each and every one of them, not only do we rate ourselves, but even more importantly, borders are no excuse for human rights abuse. And if we really want to end modern-day slavery, what is contained in this all-important book helps them and helps all of us. It's a guide as to how to improve our efforts. This year, China, Russia, and Uzbekistan finally have to confront their records. The report tells it like it is. For example, the TIP report states that, and I quote in pertinent part, the Chinese government's birth limitation policy and a cultural preference for sons created a skewed ratio of 118 boys to 100 girls in China, which served as a key source for demand for the trafficking of foreign women and brides for Chinese men and forced prostitution. Women from Burma, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Mongolia are transported to China after being recruited through marriage brokers or fraudulent employment offers, the report goes on, where they are subsequently subjected to forced prostitution and forced labor. Traffickers recruited girls and young women, often rural areas of China, using a combination of fraudulent job offers, imposition of large travel fees, and threats of physical or financial harm to obtain and maintain their service in prostitution, close quote. Because tens of millions of girls have been systematically killed by sex selection abortion over the past 3 decades, resulted in an unprecedented number of missing women and girls in China, demand for prostitutes and so-called brides is absolutely exploding in China, and it's not getting any better anytime soon. As a direct consequence of the barbaric one-child-per-couple policy in effect since 1979, China has become the global magnet for sex traffickers. Women and young girls have been, and are today, being reduced to commodities and coerced into prostitution. Without serious and sustained action by Beijing and the international community, it is only going to get worse. The TIP report also makes clear that Chinese law remains inadequate, and I quote here, to combat all forms of trafficking, and the government of China's efforts to protect trafficking victims remain inadequate. In addition, China's government continued to perpetuate human trafficking in at least 320 state-run institutions. I, along with Congressman Frank Wolf, visited one of those state-run institutions in the early 1990s, Beijing Prison Number 1. We were shocked to observe the horrific conditions imposed on inmates, including more than 40 Tiananmen Square human rights activists. The report makes clear that state-sponsored forced labor is part of a systemic form of repression known as re-education through labor. The government reportedly profits from this forced labor and many prisoners and detainees, close quote. With this report, we have done right by the millions of trafficking victims in China. With this report, we are holding China to account for its complicity in profits off modern-day slavery. It is my sincere hope that the truth will turn the tide in China. However, I am disappointed, and I would say this with all respect to my friend and Ambassador Lucia DeBaca, we were disappointed, many of us, to see that Vietnam was not downgraded to Tier 2 watch list or to Tier 3. Vietnam's labor export companies, most of which are owned by or affiliated with the government of Vietnam, have been engaged in practices that lead to debt bondage and forced labor. The government of Vietnam has yet to pay millions of dollars of damages to Vietnamese labor trafficking victims found in the United States and its territories as ordered by U.S. courts. Vietnamese trafficking victims in other countries report that government of Vietnam sides with the traffickers to keep them in bondage when the victims seek help. Other reports indicate that the Vietnamese embassy in Russia, and we had a hearing on this, is actively working with organized crime to enslave Vietnamese nationals in sweatshops and brothels. And the TIP report itself notes reports that officials at border crossings and checkpoints accept bribes from traffickers. Some notable trends in the 2013 report include Tier 1, 30 countries as compared to 33 in 2012. Tier 2, 92 countries as compared to 93 in 2012. Tier 2 watch list, 44 countries as compared to 42 in 2012. And Tier 3, 20 countries as compared to 17 in 2012. The African region increased its prosecutions by 45%, according to the report, labor prosecutions by 500%, its convictions by 16%, and its victims' identification by 13%. The African region, however, is the region with the greatest number of Tier 3 countries and does not contain any Tier 1 countries. The East Asia and Pacific region saw a 23% decrease in prosecutions, but a 28% increase in convictions and a slight increase in the number of victims who were identified. The number of victims identified remained alarmingly low, however, at 8,521, in a region where the ILO has said that there are nearly 12 million people enslaved. The number of labor convictions, 103, also remains extremely low in a region of the world plagued by labor trafficking. The European region saw a slight drop in prosecutions, but a 13% increase in convictions and a 17% increase in victims identified. I would note parenthetically that since 2008, in the European space, some 54,000 victims have been identified. So there is a robust effort underway there to find, identify, and help victims. The Near East region saw a 19% increase in prosecutions in 2012, more than doubled its conviction rate, largely due to efforts in the United Arab Emirates. The Near East region also more than doubled its number of victims identified. The region has the greatest relative proportion, however, of Tier 3 countries. The South and Central Asia region saw slight but appreciable increases in prosecutions, some 7%, convictions 5%, and the number of victims identified at 13. India, one of the first countries to be moved off the Tier 2 watch list under the TPVA of 2008 two-year rule, remained a questionable Tier 2 ranking for a second year. Out of a nearly 2 billion people, only 4,415 victims were identified. Finally, the Western Hemisphere region, in which the United States, of course, is included, prosecutions increased by 72% and convictions increased by 44%, including 650% increase in labor trafficking convictions. However, victim identification, sadly, decreased by 15%. 8 countries in the region improved their anti-trafficking laws in 2012. Cuba is the only country in the region to be Tier 3. Colombia and Nicaragua share Tier 1 status with the United States and with Canada. Again, I look forward to the testimony by our very distinguished witness, Ambassador Lucia DeBacca. But before that, we'll yield to my friend and colleague, the ranking member, Ms. Bass.
Mr. Chairman, once again, I want to thank you for your ongoing efforts to combat human trafficking. I always appreciate your focus and your steadfast commitment, and I look forward to continuing to work with you to develop smart policies that protect victims and prevent human trafficking globally and domestically. I also want to express my deep gratitude to Ambassador DeBacca. Did I do that okay? And I especially appreciate your inclusion about what's going on in the United States in the report. I mean, I know that's always there, but you had a slightly different focus this time. The United Nations defines trafficking in persons as the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons. While we hold this hearing annually, this definition of trafficking reminds us that efforts to end human trafficking are needed more today than ever before. The International Labor Organization estimates that human trafficking generates well over $30 billion annually, a figure that rivals some nations' gross domestic product. The 2013 TIP report clearly indicates that far too victims have been identified, and my fear is that if we don't quickly identify more victims, they will be lost to organized crime, pimps, johns, and others that care little about their well-being or physical, mental, or emotional safety. With social scientists estimating that 27 million women, children, and men are trafficked, the fact that only 40,000 have been identified is woefully inadequate and frankly disturbing. We can and must do more to assist nations everywhere with helping identify and protect victims and not treating them as criminals. I'm pleased that this year's TIP report is themed Victim Identification. Ambassador, once again, I commend your leadership on this issue, working through the interagency as well as your direct foreign government engagement to ensure that a comprehensive response to fight trafficking includes thorough enforcement alongside compassionate care for vulnerable communities, including runaways, foster youth, disabled, stateless, ethnic minorities, and migrants. As I look at this year's tier ranking map of Africa, there appears to be progress in nations like Madagascar, Sierra Leone, Senegal, and the Republic of Congo, yet other nations have not progressed and have fallen backwards. The good news, however, is that prosecutions, convictions, victim identifications, and new legislation across the continent appear to be at an all-time high. I'm eager to hear what new efforts can help increase focus on issues of child soldiers, sexual exploitation, as well as forced servitude and labor throughout Africa. The TIP office should be congratulated for efforts to work with the South African government to advocate for and advise on passage of legislation that prohibits all forms of trafficking in persons. I'm pleased that the TIP report continues also to evaluate the United States' efforts to address human trafficking. In this section, the TIP report highlights the critical needs to strengthen efforts to serve and protect domestic populations vulnerable to trafficking, including the nearly 500,000 children in foster care. Sadly, the instability and traumatic experience of foster children make them particularly susceptible to commercial exploitation. Worse still, recent headlines indicate that PIMPs are now targeting foster youth group homes as hubs to recruit vulnerable girls right here in this city as well as around the country. Across the country, data shows that between 65 and 85% of domestic minor trafficking victims are current or former foster youth. In Los Angeles County alone, my home county, hundreds of domestic youth are commercially exploited each year. In 2012, the Los Angeles County reported that at least 60% of youth identified as victims of sex trafficking were in the foster care system. Estimates by local authorities indicate that the actual numbers are much higher, but there is a lack of available data to confirm these statistics. As an advocate of our nation's foster youth, I'm pleased to see that the TIP report urges the United States to increase training to caseworkers and other professionals who serve children in the child welfare system, similar to, as the chair mentioned, with the airline industry. We need to train our own service providers here. The report specifically notes that the federal government should issue official guidance to provide child welfare agencies with specific tools and information to better identify and serve foster youth who are trafficked or at risk of being trafficked. Furthermore, the TIP report outlines the need for enhanced data collection to better understand the scope and scale of domestic human trafficking. In order to address these very gaps, I'm proud to have introduced the Strengthening Child Welfare Response to Trafficking Act, along with my colleague on the subcommittee, Representative Tom Marino. This bill will direct the Department of Health and Human Services to issue guidance to child welfare agencies with appropriate tools to identify, document, educate, and counsel child victims of trafficking and those at risk, and require child welfare agencies to report the numbers of victims of trafficking in foster care, as well as their plans to combat trafficking, to the federal government. I don't know, and perhaps we can get into it in questions, I don't know if you work with Human Services here, but it would be great to have that collaboration going. In closing, Ambassador, I want to urge you to continue to pursue an interagency process that calls on all relevant departments and agencies to address this issue, like I described a minute ago. I've been generally impressed by the work of the Interagency Task Force to develop a comprehensive strategic action plan on victim services here in the U.S. to ensure that our limited resources are being maximized. The decision to include a public comment period to incorporate the input of broader civil society, including survivors of trafficking, into the plan increases its chance for success to increase awareness, identify more victims, and improve services. I look forward to posing some questions later on in this hearing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Roy. I now yield to the distinguished chairman of the full committee, Mr. Ed Royce from California.
I thank Chairman Smith for holding this important hearing. I just want to also take a moment and thank Chris Smith for all he's tried to do to drive this issue, as well as our former Speaker of the State Assembly, Karen Bass, a member of this committee, for everything she is attempting to do to stop human trafficking, especially trafficking of children. And the definition of a civilized world is one that comes to the aid of those who are most defenseless. And when you look at the situations around the world of children sold into slavery, sold into trafficking, or these situations that Karen's been talking about in terms of the group homes, we have girls as young as 13, 14 years old. These Romeos are sent there. These girls never have any idea the end goal that these men have for them. They think they're being rescued. But what is about to happen to them is a very, very horrendous situation, followed by a very short lifespan for most of these young children. And we want to thank Ambassador Sidibaka for his work and for being here today with the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons. We had a hearing earlier this year on this subject prior to the report, and this modern-day slavery is what it is something that affects the lives of so many millions around the world, but also, as we heard in testimony, also the lives of people here in the United States. And the commitment of the Foreign Affairs Committee, as Chris Smith will attest, is deep, it's long-standing, it's fully bipartisan, and our goal is to put a whole lot more pressure on governments around the world to get engaged here. Earlier this year, I supported the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization, but I have concerns that cuts to the tip office and other aspects of the trafficking reauthorization contained in that bill might harm the important work of the tip office. I know that Chairman Smith is working hard to make certain that at the end of the day we do more to lean in on these governments. And against this background, all of us were closely watching this country's tier rankings to see how the State Department would handle the statutory limit on how long countries could stay parked on Tier 2, on the watch list. And so I was somewhat encouraged that for the first time in memory, this year's TIP report accurately ranks certain important countries, such as China and Russia, based on the facts on the ground and based on their lack of significant efforts to address the problem. I do wonder why other countries were not similarly treated. For example, I'm very concerned that the government of Cambodia remains part of the problem. My Chief of Staff spent her vacation in the past working with children in Cambodia who had been sold, who had been trafficked, with the knowledge of local police, with the knowledge, full knowledge of the local government. But I do believe that these new Tier 3 downgrades are well-deserved. And I think that increased the credibility of the TIP report. But at the end of the day, I want to see more done across the board, especially with governments like Cambodia. The report also underscores the broader challenges we face. Twice as many countries slipped backwards in this year's report than have been improved since last year. And finally, in terms of this global issue hitting close to home, just yesterday, the Orange County District Attorney, Tony Rakakis, filed human trafficking charges against a Saudi princess accused of exploiting a Kenyan victim in California. So we'll be following that case with interest, and I thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Chairman Rice, for your leadership and for your very eloquent comments today. Dr. Burr.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. Ranking Member Bass. Again, this is an incredibly important series of hearings, and even one case of human trafficking is one case too many. But when you're talking about millions, this is an epidemic that requires all of our resources. And again, I applaud this committee for taking it up and making it a priority. And we have to make it a priority for the entire population in America. It goes to our core values of human decency, of human respect and dignity. We certainly have to focus in on what's happening internationally, but we also have to look at the supply side of this as well. We have to raise our standards of values. So when we're shopping someplace, when we're buying our goods and services, we know we're not spending resources at places that are engaging in human trafficking. We also have to, in our conversation, Ambassador Sidibaka, you pointed out the importance of just basic education, so that our first responders can recognize and report potential cases, that our healthcare providers, that our teachers, that everyone in this country can recognize it, so we stop it here domestically as well, and stamp that out. And you identified a case of a police officer in Sacramento who, just with a single day of training, really raised his awareness. So, this is an epidemic that has to stop. And again, it goes to our basic values as just human beings. So again, I applaud the efforts of this committee. Again, this is a bipartisan issue that just is about human decency and what we stand for. So we look forward to working with you, and you clearly have the full support of all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Burr. Mr. Meadows.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ambassador, for being here to testify. And as most of us in this room know, this annual Trafficking in Persons report is one of the best tools that we have in terms of identifying human trafficking. It reports on some 186 countries, utilizes U.S. government research, foreign government statistics, NGO information, and evaluates really whether a country is meeting, and may I stress, minimum standards to eliminate human trafficking. But really none of that matters. We've had a number of hearings here. None of that matters if the report is not acted on. And for me, I think that's what I look forward is how can we make sure that if a bad report is presented, that it has consequences that comes with that. We look over and over, and we've heard testimony in this very room, how if there are no consequences or if there's not a consistent standard, what we find is that human trafficking really doesn't change. The State Department has not let us know if they will put on sanctions for any Tier 3 countries. And yet they have the law and the capability to do that, and we seem to resist that. There's obviously some very encouraging statistics that we've seen here in this report, some that are not quite as encouraging. But what we all know is that this will not improve unless there's an incentive, a real incentive, not just empty words and empty rhetoric, but a real incentive to make sure that we stop this. It is a bipartisan. Both the chairman and the ranking member have said it so well that we have to place an emphasis on this, not just abroad, but here in the United States. My daughter has been involved in human trafficking issues in the United States for a long time to highlight that. And what we have happening also in our neighborhoods, in our communities around us, must be stopped. And so with that, Mr. Ambassador, I thank you for your heart and what it represents. Chairman Royce pointed out one other thing with regards to VAWA. When it passed, I was deeply concerned about a reduction in some of the emphasis on human trafficking, both from a reporting standpoint, a jurisdictional standpoint, and a funding standpoint, that I look forward to working with the chairman and the ranking member to hopefully correct. I would look forward to hearing your testimony on that. I yield back, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Meadows. Now turn to our distinguished witness and thank him for being here. Ambassador Lucy DeBacca coordinates U.S. government activities in the global fight against contemporary forms of slavery. He serves as senior advisor to the Secretary of State and directs the State Department's Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons, which, as we all know, assesses global trends, provides training and technical assistance, and advocates for the end of modern-day slavery. Ambassador DeBacca formerly served as counsel to the House Committee on the Judiciary, where his portfolio included modern slavery issues, among many others. He also served as a federal prosecutor with the Department of Justice, where he prosecuted and successfully convicted dozens of pimps and abusive employers and helped liberate hundreds of victims from servitude. And without objection, his full resume will be made a part of the record. So, Mr. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Bass, and other members of the committee. Thank you for the invitation to testify today about the 2013 Trafficking in Persons report. But most importantly, thank you for your ongoing concern and leadership in our country's effort to combat modern slavery. Since I became Ambassador at Large 4 years ago, a lot has changed in the anti-trafficking movement. More governments are living up to their responsibility to fight this crime, more stakeholders are contributing expertise and resources, and more individuals are aware of the way that modern slavery affects their lives. But one thing that has not changed is the partnership across the United States government when it comes to fighting human trafficking, in both the administration and on Capitol Hill, in both the House and the Senate, and in both sides of the aisle. It's a partnership that secured the renewal of the anti-trafficking law earlier this year, a partnership rooted in the idea that we as a nation need to stand up for universal values, values of freedom, justice, and dignity of all people here at home and around the world. These are the values that drive our work to fight modern slavery. These are the values that drive our imperative to deliver on the 150-year-old promise of freedom made by President Lincoln. At the same time, we also make combating trafficking in persons a priority in domestic and foreign policy because doing so is in our country's strategic interest. Trafficking persons is a crime that threatens rule of law. It feeds on the vulnerability of marginalized populations, creates further instability and damages communities, corrupts labor markets and global supply chains, the very things that are essential to a thriving global economy. So it's not only the right thing to do, but the smart thing to do. And as President Obama made clear in his speech at the Clinton Global Initiative meeting last fall, the United States will continue to be a leader in this global movement. Now, President Clinton said something right after that. He said that the foundation world and all of us in public life had not necessarily done enough to deliver on that promise. And so that challenge that was put down not just by President Obama that day, but by President Clinton as well, is a challenge that should ring out for all of us. It's the challenge that Mr. Berra suggests. What am I doing? What are we doing in our own lives as consumers, as policymakers, as Americans? We ask ourselves that question each day at the State Department. And what we do is we try to press forward through assistance to organizations working on the front lines, providing aid to victims, and helping governments build up their capacity. We bring more stakeholders to the table through partnership efforts, harness civil society, the resource and innovativeness of the private sector, and the commitment of groups and individuals who, like us, reject slavery in the 21st century. And through diplomacy, we urge governments to fully embrace their responsibility to deal with this crime, and we will work with any government that takes this problem seriously. One of our most important tools along these lines is the annual Trafficking in Persons report. I would like to say a few words about our major findings this year. My prepared testimony goes into greater detail, and Mr. Chairman, you, I think, gave us a very good overview as well of some of the trends that we're seeing out there. Once again, this report tells us that trafficking in persons affects every country in the world. And it also tells us that there is no government in the world that is doing enough to fight it. Our major focus this year is the importance and challenge of effective victim identification. When done well, victim identification opens the door to the support and services trafficking victims, trafficking survivors need. Victim identification leads to more investigations and prosecutions and allows survivors the opportunity, if they choose, to share their experiences and have a voice in the way that we shape our anti-trafficking policies and practices. It is the critical first step in stopping this crime. And yet only about 47,000 victims were brought to light in the last year, compared to that 27 million people living in slavery. That massive gap represents the millions who toil unseen and beyond the reach of law, and it shows how far we have to go in this effort. At the same time, we do see modest gains, more victims identified, more countries adopted modern anti-trafficking laws, more countries moving toward a whole-of-government approach so necessary to confront this crime. Now, beyond the global trends, the report includes the assessments of the countries and territories on their government's effectiveness in combating this crime. And we have seen an unfortunate reversal of the trend over the last few years. More countries were downgraded this year than were upgraded by a margin of nearly 2 to 1. This year, 30 countries, including the United States, are on Tier 1 in the report, meaning that the governments of these countries are complying with the minimum standards set by Congress. And I'd like to be clear, and I would like to repeat what Mr. Meadows has said. These are only minimum standards. A Tier 1 is not a perfect score. A Tier 1 is merely a passing grade. Every country, every government can be doing more to deal with this challenge. This year, 92 countries are on Tier 2. Those governments don't meet all the minimum standards, but we're seeing some serious efforts there. And 44 countries are on the Tier 2 watch list, countries that, despite making some efforts, aren't getting positive results, or the situation may actually be getting worse. An example, I think, based on that reflects Chairman Royce's concerns, Cambodia. The downgrade of Cambodia to Tier 2 watch list this year, very much reflecting a downward trend in that country. And then, of course, Tier 3, those countries where the governments aren't doing much at all to deal with this crime. And this year, there are 21 countries. This report does not pull any punches. It's thorough and candid. And as Secretary Kerry said at the rollout of the report, this report is tough because this is a tough issue, and it demands serious attention. It's tough, but it isn't necessarily punitive. We're not claiming to have the answers, because we don't. We know that the better information that we have about modern slavery, what works there and what works here, the more we're able to share those best practices, that we're able to learn from our partners, and we're able to share what we're doing correctly, the better we all will be in confronting it. So we're not just pointing a finger, we're extending a hand to anyone who agrees that this is a problem that we need to grapple with. The Trafficking in Persons Office 60 staff members are committed abolitionists, subject matter experts, and experienced diplomats, and they work with their colleagues in the field with ever-intensifying expertise across the U.S. Foreign Service and across civil society. One of those staff members, Senior Coordinator for Reports and Political Affairs, Mark Taylor, is leaving us next week for an exciting opportunity in Southeast Asia. We all owe him a debt of gratitude for his decade of leadership, because under his command, the Reports and Political Affairs section has seen a report that has shone a light in the dark corners of the world and driven policy change for the better for the vulnerable around the world. So this report is a guide for ourselves, for governments, and for everyone who shares our goal of a world without slavery. Thank you all for your commitment and your partnership.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for your testimony, and again, thank you for your extraordinary leadership. Let me just begin with a couple of questions. Nigeria was a Tier 1 country in 2010 and 2011. I actually visited Nigeria and met with their JTIP, their equivalent of our efforts to combat trafficking. They seem to be very, very focused. I visited 2 shelters. They were inadequately housed, but it was a resourcing problem. And I'm wondering if you might speak to why they're Tier 2. Of course, they're not Tier 3, and they're not a watch list country. But when Nigeria was put on Tier 1, it was cause for celebration that one of the most populous of the African countries had made such progress. What has happened?
Mr. Smith, I'm glad you asked about Nigeria, because to us there is so much promise in NAPTIP, the Nigerian anti-trafficking structure. The very structure of NAPTIP and the way that they're staffing their offices, to us, is an innovation that all countries in the world should look to. This notion of bringing together police officers, prosecutors, and social workers assigned to the same case on the same day. It's not police officers work a case for a year and then they maybe take it to a prosecutor who turns it down because they never met the victim. It's not social workers as an afterthought. It's actually integrating those 3 things. And that was, I think, one of the things that drove us in 2009 as far as the upgrade was concerned. There's been some leadership changes in NAPTIP over the last year or so, and I think that those are also things that we're looking at that will have a very positive effect. The new head of NAPTIP is energetic, she's innovative, and she's serious. And we think that that's putting them on an upward trajectory. I can't say what the tier rankings would be for Nigeria in any given year. We have to look at the evidence for those 12-month periods. But we do think that there's, I think, positive movement in Nigeria. Nigeria as a model. I think one of the things that we've seen is whether a country is a Tier 1 country or a Tier 2 country, if there's an innovation, we need to call people's effect to that. And I, on the Senate side, was in front of an Asia subcommittee that was perhaps a little more skeptical about Nigeria and skeptical about the fact that we would think that much wealthier or other high-status countries in the Asia region could learn from a Nigeria on a law enforcement issue. And frankly, that was something that we took back, and we went straight to those governments and said, Nigeria is doing this right, and we all need to look at them as a model. Again, each year we look at the rankings and we'll see where we go, but we are heartened by some of the innovations that we see out of NAPTIP.
A few weeks ago, Mr. Ambassador, the chairwoman of the Foreign Affairs Committee for China, Madam Fu, sat right where you're sitting, but facing the other way, and we had a dialogue, members of our committee. I brought up the trafficking issue and the nexus with the one-child per couple policy and the gendercide that has occurred systematically over the last 30 years through sex selection abortion, and the fact that tens of millions of girls and now young women are missing simply because of sex selection abortion. And as I pointed out in my opening, drawing from the TIP report, you point out that the skewed sex ratio of 118 boys to 100 girls in China has served as a key source of demand for the trafficking of foreign women, and I would also add for domestic women moving in-country around in China. Madam Fu was indignant that I even brought it up when I mentioned to her that 600 women, just under 600 women per day commit suicide in China. It's the only place in the world where the relationship or the numbers far exceed male suicides, directly attributable to the one-child per couple policy and now this horrible consequence of trafficking. She said I was making it up, and I pointed out that our State Department's Country Reports on Human Rights Practices makes very clear that number came from their Chinese government Centers for Disease Control, and she looked at it and walked away in a huff. My question is, what was the Chinese reaction to being placed on Tier 3? If you could maybe elaborate on how this demand is only getting worse, especially for the ASEAN countries where women are being trafficked into and that goes for North Korea as well, into China because of the scarcity of women. They don't exist relative to the number of males in that country. So demand has been skyrocketing, if you could speak to that as well. And thirdly, where do you think the administration may go on enforcing or implementing a sanctions regime on the PRC?
Perhaps I'll take those backwards.
Oh, sure.
Once the Trafficking in Persons report comes out, there's then a 90-day period in which we look at the possibility of sanctions for the Tier 3 countries. And we work with our colleagues in the regional bureaus, we work with the White House and others in looking to see to what extent there is aid to those countries that we would then be having impact on, to what extent there are things that we would want to preserve the working relationship around, especially things like law enforcement training and other things that go directly to the human trafficking issue, because of course you don't want to cut off the way that you can make change with a particular country. And so trying to figure out what the universe actually is as far as U.S. foreign assistance that would be subject to sanctions. And that's the process that's going on right now. I can't speak as to where that's going to end up. I can certainly tell you, though, that we're taking it with all seriousness, not just in China's situation, but in all of the Tier 3 countries. And there's some new Tier 3 countries. There are also countries that have been in Tier 3 in the past, and each year we want to look at those with a fresh slate, because we want to make sure that the sanctions regime is tied to the rankings, but also tied to the situation on the ground. And that typically, I think we're usually talking about a mid-September date as far as the sanctions decision by the President. As you point out, Mr. Smith, the Trafficking in Persons report does not shy away from recognizing the interrelationship between the one-child policy, the sex ratios, and the demand, especially for women, not just for bride trafficking, but for sex trafficking as a whole. That notion of the disposability of women that we see, as Kevin Bales calls the situation of trafficking, the problem of disposable people. And I think that that's something that we have raised with the Chinese, not simply in the context of the report, but when I'm sitting down with my counterparts talking about human trafficking, it should come as no surprise that this is one of the concerns that we have. And we certainly communicate that to them. Their response this year, and without necessarily getting into the middle of particular diplomatic conversations, I think that just as we had a fruitful visit a few months ago to China, we feel that there is some room to work with the Chinese. The ratification of the Palermo Protocol, finally, the new plan of action. These are very positive things. The new plan of action came out after the reporting period closed, and so it's not something that's necessarily reflected in this report. But the new plan of action for the first time actually says, let's look at unofficial work. It had been that trafficking could only happen officially in in China if you had abuse within a labor unit. And if you weren't an official labor unit, then you weren't employed, and so therefore you couldn't be held in forced labor. So all of the underground economy was exempted from the application of the law. So the notion of them closing that loophole, the notion of them looking with the All China Women's Federation so that you could have the screening of people who were found in prostitution as a matter of course. These are all things that we're enthusiastic about when we look at that action plan. That action plan is a future promise, and future promises under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act are Tier 2 watch list criteria. And so when we look at that action plan, when we look at what may come from it, we're going to be working with the Chinese, and I think that their response to the report and the discussions that we're going to be having with them coming out of their response shows that there's, I think, a lot of places that we can work together on this rather than being at loggerheads.
Okay. I do have many other questions, but I'll yield to my friend, Ms. Bass.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for yielding. I actually want to ask you a couple of questions, but not as ambassador in your prior role, thinking about the U.S. and giving your years of experience as a prosecutor. So we're grappling with a couple of things. I mean, right now we know 10 states have passed safe harbor laws to protect children from being criminalized, and charged with prostitution, when I don't believe a person that is under the age of consent could be considered a prostitute. Mm-hmm. So my question would be, what would you advise Congress to do in order to encourage or incentivize states to enact strong safe harbor laws? And then, until those laws are passed, I'm also concerned about girls that already have that on their record. Then they try to turn their life around and they have soliciting. So how do we address that? And I want to know if you're familiar with any states that have been successful in eliminating charges related to sexual exploitation. California has led the way in one area, but...
Well, this is actually part of my ambassadorial hat as well, because of the Senior Policy Operating Group, which I chair, is a way in which we bring the entire interagency together to wrestle with these. I think I'm probably unique among the ambassadorial corps in that I have the domestic responsibility as well. We try to do that as collaborators and with a relatively light touch across the administration, getting everybody moving in the same direction, especially as the President has, I think, shown such leadership on this over the last 8 months or so. What we've seen is a very exciting set of legislative sessions this spring. There's some states in which this was the only session because they're on 2-year cycles. And so we've seen an explosion in not just laws being passed and sent to the governor for signature in places, not just in your states that have done a lot on this over the years, like California and New Jersey, but also in places like West Virginia and even Wyoming finally passing their state anti-trafficking statute. But that notion of safe harbor and the notion of expungement, we're starting to now see that. And it's something that my office has been working with the state's attorneys general and the National Conference of State Legislators on. It's something that our friends over at DOJ and HHS especially have been working with.
Can we get that from you, about the states and all? We get that information?
Very much so. I mean, I think that, a lot of that ends up being, kind of the normal type of intergovernmental work, the phone calls of encouragement and things like that. I've testified by phone for instance, in the West Virginia legislature. We don't have a product that we're sending out to them, et cetera, but we can certainly get you some more information about what we've been doing. And I think that part of it is that again, the bipartisan effort of the National Attorney General's Association, led by Martha Coakley last year, but then really pushing out now as not just a one-year presidential initiative, but something that is going to sustain itself. I think that that's one of the things that we've seen. When you hear the stories of these women who've been able to get their records expunged, they're able to get a cosmetology license, they're able to move on with their lives.
Mr. Ambassador, let me just ask you with regards to Vietnam, which is one of the disappointing parts. And I know you don't make all the decisions. The regional bureaus certainly have input, to say the least. And there's very often, I've heard this from the previous ambassadors, including Ambassador Mark Lagon, that it's a battle, fighting to ensure that the right tirages or assignment to a tier occurs. Vietnam, it seems to me, and I recently introduced and got passed in full committee the Vietnam Human Rights Act. This will be the third time that I try to get that bill enacted into law, and held a hearing on it. There were actually 2 hearings. Vietnam is deteriorating when it comes to human rights at breakneck speed. There have been more show trials in Vietnam in 2013. In the first 3 months of 2013, 40, than there were in all of 2012. As a matter of fact, it was pointed out by Human Rights Watch that there has been a huge deterioration across the board when it comes to human rights in Vietnam. When it comes to trafficking, as well as designation of CPC, country of particular concern, which I think has been a missed opportunity on our part to so designate Vietnam such a country, because on religious persecution, they have also been in a race to the bottom. But when it comes to the tip, Vietnam, certainly both labor and sex trafficking, I believe, has really deteriorated. The TIP report acknowledges that Vietnam's anti-tip law has not been implemented because criminal penalties have not been established. Prosecution is limited to 2 provisions in the existing penal code, Article 119, on trafficking of women, and Article 120, but none of the labor trafficking activities committed under the government's labor export program involving government-owned or sanctioned labor export companies have been prosecuted. And I'm wondering, given that record, and you were personally involved with the first case to be prosecuted under the law that I wrote, the TPVA of 2000, by Daewoosa in American Samoa, and they still have not been forthcoming with the judgments that were rendered in that decision either. So that's 13 years old. But that pattern continues. And as I said before in my opening, we heard from a woman who testified right where you sit, who was trafficked to Russia, forced into a brothel, and the Vietnamese, at least 3 people in the Vietnamese embassy were tipped off the brothel owner when the Russian government was willing to send in police, to liberate those women. So complicity are them. It couldn't have been more clear. And she told the story of her sister who had been so ill-treated, and to this day, others who have spoken out in Vietnam fear for their lives. She said she feared for her life and her family members who are still in Vietnam. So it would seem that the government has done an awful job. And if you could speak to that issue, because it seems to me that Vietnam should be, and I have 5 separate questions just on Vietnam that I will submit for the record to you, but it seems to me there ought to be that they deserve to be on Tier 3 just like China.
I think that one of the things that we've seen in Vietnam over the last year or so is that there have been some of the structural activities on the part of the government, the decrees that put out guidance on victim identification, a new policy on people who are arrested for drug offenses not immediately being put into those re-education camp, detention facility type things where they were facing forced labor. But as the report this year sets out, this is a situation which is very much, as you recognize, a mixed bag. We see almost 500 offenders being sentenced. That's a positive. On the other hand, we also see these situations with the labor export. We see a good track record of identifying almost 900 victims, but when you look at that, it's 900 victims, almost all of whom are of internal sex trafficking cases, as opposed to looking at the forced labor, whether it's external or otherwise. And I think that that's where we see kind of this mixed bag situation. There's something good that's happening, and then there are these kind of bigger overarching structural issues. So it's certainly something that we're taking into account as we now switch over to kind of the diplomatic phase after this initial reporting situation. And I think that it's something that, as you mentioned, I've had personal experience with the overseas labor issues on Vietnam. It's something that we're continuing to look at, we're continuing to monitor, and especially our embassy in Moscow, because that seems like this pipeline has now opened up. Garment factories east of Moscow, folks in, whether it's in service industries or light construction, that notion of the Vietnamese and Russian guest worker situation has always been present, but it seems to be perhaps, if not intensifying, it's being reported on more when the abuses are coming out in the Russian press. And so it's one of those things where we have to look at not simply what are we monitoring that's happening within Vietnam, but starting to look more at where are the Vietnamese being sent and what's happening to them once they get there.
Could I just ask you, has the Vietnamese government initiated charges against labor export companies or against traffickers involved with the Russian case?
Not to my knowledge, but I'd have to check
Okay.
back and
if you could
look
get
at
back to us on that, that would be
Indeed.
helpful. And again, I just would, Vietnam did a very good job of fooling people when the bilateral agreement was coming forward, that they would make serious efforts on religious freedom and other human rights abuses. And even people who signed Block 8406, similar to Václav Havel's Charter 77, a great human rights manifesto, they have become targeted in a very systematic way. So what I'm suggesting is that the backdrop of decrees being promulgated need to be looked at with a grain of salt when that's exactly what they did with religious freedom. I remember our ambassador at large for religious freedom under the Bush administration thought that he had what he called deliverables when it came to religious freedom issues, and not one of them was acted upon, but it got them off the CPC designation. And they never went back on it as they ought to have. And so I think they are very good at gaming the situation and talking a good game, but they don't walk the walk. So I would hope you would take that back, and I know you care about this deeply, so take a good hard look at it, if you would, on Vietnam. The report also indicates that the government of India provided no information on investigations or prosecutions of trafficking offenses, or on convictions or punishments of trafficking offenders. So my question would be, many of us, I remember vividly Gary Haugen, who you know and I know so well, 10 years ago sat where you sat at one of the hearings that I had on trafficking and showed on showed a video of police being tipped off in Mumbai when these young 13, 12, 11-year-old girls had been hidden. They had the video of these little girls who were hidden and then were brought up out of a cellar. Their eyes were all, they could barely see because they were in a dark cellar. But the police have been tipped off, and that seems to be the modus operandi in many situations in India. And certainly police are, under the minimum standards, by definition, are considered part of the government, because I'm the one who wrote those minimum standards with a great deal of assistance from my colleagues. But we made sure that government complicity was inclusive of police. And I'm wondering, again, why India didn't even deserve, how it can qualify as Tier 2. and not Tier 3 or at least watch list?
Well, India is certainly a country that has a very serious trafficking problem. I think it's certainly the scope of the problem, also the way it manifests with, as you mentioned, the brothels with children, the folks on farms and rice mills and brick kilns and other factory-type settings. It's a multifaceted trafficking problem in one of the largest countries in the world, and manifests itself differently in different states and different regions. I think one of the things that we've seen that's important over the last few years in India is that notion of especially the Interior Ministry coming together around this issue, the leadership from the minister themselves and some of the high-ranking staff that is showing the kind of political will that it takes to fight human trafficking, the creation of the anti-human trafficking units out in the field. And we recognize that some of those are a work in progress. The notion that you've got about almost 500 anti-trafficking units in the police, and some of those are clicking along, and especially if they have relationships with the non-governmental organizations, and not just the international non-governmental organizations from the U.S. Or from Europe, but the Indians who are working on this. A number of those organizations I think, played a key role in the passage of the trafficking legislation this last year in India, and that's something that we can't overstate. India had been going in a different direction than the rest of the world over the last 10 years on human trafficking legal regime. Their Immoral Trafficking Prevention Act actually was something that applied to the persons in prostitution as much as it did to the pimps and traffickers who were abusing them. And so one of the reasons why we were suspect of the numbers that one would get historically from India was that many of those numbers were very probably women and children in prostitution who had been prosecuted under the Immoral Trafficking Prevention Act. Now we finally have a modern anti-slavery, anti-trafficking law that aims at the abusers, not at the victim. That came in right at the end of the reporting period. It came in because of, we think, that new relationship between the Ministry of Interior and civil society, responding, of course, to the horrible, tragic gang rapes that were being reported upon this spring. But it was, I think, a situation where we look at kind of where we are in India this year. What have we seen over the last 12 years? And I think especially the work of the HTUs, which is a rebuke of sorts to those who had claimed in the past that the Indian government could not have a centrally managed anti-trafficking effort because of their constitution. The Home Ministry has proven them wrong, and I think it's something that we want to continue to support the Home Ministry in as they continue to do their work.
Now, have they enforced, that obviously happened before the report was published or before the time closed. Have you been pleased with the progress they've made in enforcing their new law?
Well, I think, it always takes some months for laws to get out of the blocks, as it were. It's not a drag race.
Right.
And so, I think it's something that we're going to be really looking to see as to how that law comes out. One of the things we saw in a similar...
Does it treat the Dalits equally?
Excuse me?
Does it treat the Dalits equally?
The Dalits, it applies to them as well as everyone else in India. Now, the proof is in the pudding, and I think that that's what we're going to see, is the enforcement then done in the same kind of neutrality that the text of the law itself would have.
The report shows that the victim identification in the Western Hemisphere decreased by 15%. Is there a reason for that?
I don't think that we have enough to really go from that as to speculate as to exactly why.
Okay.
I think one of the things that we're seeing is that there's a little bit of a double-edged sword with our increased attention to the data collection efforts, in that we are really interrogating the data. which sometimes means that we end up looking at claimed victims identified by government, and we'll say, now what you're actually telling us is about alien smuggling cases, or those are people who you prosecuted for prostitution offenses. So by interrogating the data, in some countries, we'll end up having a circumstance where it looks like there's less victims identified than in prior years, when in fact what was happening is those prior years' victim identification claims may have not been as accurate as this year's. So I think it's something that we're working through, especially with a lot of the Latin American governments, as we're bringing them into the modern definitions of human trafficking. The OAS plan of action and some of the work that UNODC has done in the Western Hemisphere is getting more and more countries to be able to differentiate between alien smuggling on the one hand and human trafficking on the others. And so I think that we're going to be seeing much more accurate reporting as far as victims identified. But it all comes back to that definition, whether in the Indian context, whether in the Western Hemisphere context.
Mr. Ambassador, let me just ask you about Cuba, which is the only Tier 3 country in the Western Hemisphere. According to the report, Cuba still does not prohibit prostitution of children aged 16 and older. This is of great concern given the administration's effort to open tourism between the U.S. and Cuba. And over the past several years, I've read many reports about the abuse of children in Cuba for child sex tourism, particularly to Europe and to Canada. I remember I was in Geneva at the UN, when it was still called the UN Human Rights Commission before it became the Council. And there was one report that some activists had that clearly showed that this is a big moneymaker for Fidel Castro. And the man that had it was actually hit by some of the Cuban, he was out running, a van stopped, he was cold-cocked in the head by some of these, thugs. Because he was raising this issue among delegations, including the U.S. delegation in Geneva. I read the report, and it was horrible how children are exploited in Cuba. And I'm wondering if you might want to expand upon that, and whether or not sex tourism prosecutions might be included in the report, to give a further sense of just how bad it is. Parenthetically, I remember I was in Brasilia some years ago meeting with parliamentarians there on trafficking, and learned just how many child predators make their way to Brazil. And they were fully aware of it, were trying to combat it, and they did a plan of action that was, was wonderful, but it's still a problem. But Cuba, obviously, is not visited by predators from this country, at least not in large numbers, and not yet. But that could become a major problem. If you could expand upon that.
Well, I think that with Cuba, obviously, there are challenges not only as far as doing the type of law enforcement that would be necessary. As you rightly point out, the fact that the U.S. travel to Cuba is as limited as it is, I think that you've seen other countries in the region that have had more of a destination status for U.S. child sex tourists, whether it's the Dominican Republic or some of the Central American countries. I think that one of the things that we've seen, though, is that this issue of child sex tourism, this issue of child abuse, is traditionally an area that we are able to work on with countries around the world, no matter how the relationship may be on other issues. And it's something that, just as with the migration talks and other things that we hold with Cuba, it's something that we would want to continue to try to have dialogue on with the Cuban government. We all have a shared goal of protecting our children, whether those are our citizens or children here in the hemisphere, and it's something that we will work with any government in the hemisphere or around the world that's willing to work with us in protecting children.
Just let me ask you, when do you expect action on the sanctions regime as prescribed by the TPVA of 2000 and all the subsequent authorizations? Soon? Is it being looked at country by country to ensure that there is a second shoe to drop?
Indeed. That is what we're doing right now. The sanctions regime starts now. We're a little bit of walking and chewing gum at the same time, in that we're also out demarching governments, talking to governments. The Tier 2 watch list countries, especially the ones that are on the auto downgrade provisions for next year, are places where we're going to be spending a lot of our time and attention. We're doing that and working on the sanctions and restrictions analysis right now. And we typically have had that out the door in your kind of September, October area. So I think, we're looking at a couple of months as far as getting that out and getting that up to you.
Madagascar, since the coup in 2009, the country has been excluded from the AGOA, as well as the Millennium Challenge account. And the report on Madagascar, Tier 2 watch list, points out that trafficking has increased there. And of course, we need to follow our own laws. And when there is serious human rights abuse, in this case a coup, we do have to implement the law. But I'm wondering if there's mention made in the report that parents are forcing their own children into various forms of prostitution. Could you just perhaps focus a bit on Madagascar and what we might do to help mitigate a worsening problem there?
Well, I think that it's several things. I mean, obviously, the post-coup, post-March of 2009, fighting trafficking just has not been a huge priority. But we did see increase in law enforcement efforts by folks at the working level. And I think that that's one of the things that this year's ranking reflects, is the fact that maybe not at the policy level, maybe not at the central level, but the folks out in the field are doing this. We've been, I think, positively struck by how many good-hearted law enforcement folks there are in countries that have otherwise abysmal records on whether it's human rights or access to justice and rule of law. And somehow those people end up finding out about and working on human trafficking. I think it shows that there are people we can work with across the board on a lot of these governments. One of the things that we've seen is, this notion of 30 or so prosecutions that have been brought, a couple of convictions obtained. That's not insubstantial in a country that had not been doing anything, basically. I think that one of the things, though, that we really look at going forward is, what are the shelter opportunities? What are the ways that we can go after the complicit government officials? And we're starting to see the same trend, the very worrisome trend, as in other parts of East Africa, which is Malagasy women who are now ending up in the Persian Gulf as domestic servants. And I think that that's something, and especially as we look at the Africa situation, the notion of whether it's in Lebanon, for instance, in the case of the Malagasy women, whether it's in Lebanon, whether it's in the Gulf countries, other parts of the Near East region, where traditionally the servants were coming from Indonesia, were coming from the Philippines, etc. Now we're starting to see, in this situation, folks from Madagascar, but also from Kenya, from Ethiopia, from Uganda. And they're coming into a situation where there's not the same type of robust presence in their country's embassies as the Indonesians and the Filipinos perhaps have. There's not the way to call and get help or a place to flee to. And we're very concerned as we look at that situation. If you look at many of the narratives in that part of Africa, I think you'll see that reflected, and it's something that we're going to, I think, have to look at more carefully, especially because it's cutting across a couple of our regional, the way that we separate up the world. The case that Chairman Royce mentioned today, I think, is an example of that. The woman who was liberated yesterday, or the charges were brought against her abusers yesterday in California, was a Kenyan woman who had initially been trafficked to a Middle Eastern country and then brought to the United States. luckily, when she left the Middle Eastern country where she was working for that family, she was given a pamphlet by our consular officer, the Wilberforce pamphlet, that comes directly out of the 2008 Trafficking Victims Protection Act that you sponsored. And I think because of that, that was one of the reasons why when she flagged down the bus and asked for help as she ran away the other day, she actually said, I think I might be one of these trafficking victims, according to press reports. Obviously, this is a case that's under development, and we don't have any inside information. But we have been able to look at this briefly just this morning, and it sounds as though one of the things that let her know that there was a possibility of freedom was that she got the Wilberforce pamphlet from our folks at the embassy before she came to the U.S. So I think it shows that we think about the Africa Subcommittee, we think about the AF region or the NEA region or the United States. We have all of our bureaucratic silos, and we tend to think of those as all separate. I think this case, for us, shows how it really is actually interconnected. And we have to be able to, whether it's as Congress or whether it's as the State Department, we have to figure out how to make those interconnectedness to help these people, because it reflects the interconnectedness of their lives.
As soon as the tip rollout occurred, and I want to again applaud Secretary Curry for his leadership as well as your own, I headed over to the African Center for Strategic Studies, organized a forum with African security officials, including several chiefs of staff and others. Not only did I give them a copy of the tip report, every one of them, and thank you for the carton that you gave me as I left the State Department, but over the course of about an hour, it became very clear how hungry they were for information on best practices for their own militaries to curb abuses by their soldiers. Similarly, in parallel to that is the UN peacekeeper problem. The report indicates that in 2012, there were 59 allegations of sexual exploitation and abuse lodged against UN peacekeeping personnel. 52% of the allegations were against non-uniformed personnel. 30% involved children under the age of 18. Most occurred at the UN missions in the DR Congo, Cote d'Ivoire, Liberia, Haiti, and Sudan. According to the report, no information is available regarding disciplinary action, such as suspension, dismissal, censure, demotion, and referral to employers. However, the UN itself claims to know the outcomes in 27 of those cases. So my question would be, why after 7 years of addressing this issue in the DRC, for example, is this still a crisis? I would note parenthetically that I chaired 3 hearings. Jane Hall-Lute, who now is over, or was, I think, maybe still is, at Homeland Security, was number 2 under Kofi Annan, and they had a zero-tolerance policy for the UN, and she tried to do her level best to make sure that when it got to the field level, this terrible complicity and actual abuse by UN peacekeepers was ended. But now we can seemingly get information about this, and I know that some of the investigators were moved out of Nigeria, or I should say out of Goma, and I actually met with them when they were there, to places elsewhere, which makes it harder for investigators to look into what peacekeepers might be doing. But it seems troubling in the extreme that we can't get basic information from the UN as to what becomes of a UN peacekeeper who rapes a 13-year-old in Goma, who is then either sent back to his home country, or what happens to him, and we don't know. I wonder if you might want to speak to that.
Well, we share your frustration.
I'm sure you do.
That's, the baseline on this is, that notion of what we've been able to do, whether it's with trying to have pre-deployment training for our own folks when they're going out, or working through NATO structures and others. But we recognize that it's not always folks that are going out through the NATO structure. These are not U.S. service personnel who we're dealing with. And so while it's been helpful to point this out and to include it in the narratives, I think you're right that the road does lead back to UN headquarters, and it's something that we need to continue to press. It's something that just as we see the idea that there should be a zero-tolerance policy across government procurement and other standards of conduct for, say, for instance, diplomats and other government personnel, that the peacekeeper issue continues to have to be examined. And not simply examined in saying that this is a problem, but needs to be dealt with a little bit more head-on. So I think at the end of the day, this is a shared frustration that we have. There's no reason why the very people who are supposed to be bringing stability to an area should be engaged in this type of activity.
Let me just ask you briefly on the issue of juicy bars in South Korea. The report states that despite increased regulations on the E6 entertainment visas, some foreign women, and they're mostly Philippine women, who enter the country on this visa are forced into prostitution. We know from the past that many of these women, like I said, are Filipino women, and they're forced to prostitute themselves in these bars. If they don't meet their quota, they don't get paid, or they're forced to make it up with prostitution. We know for a fact, and matter of fact, I held hearings on that as well, that the U.S. has tried to put these places off limits, yet there still is a problem, and it seems to have made a comeback, as reported in the report. And I've heard independent analyses, too, and some of the Stars and Stripes and some of the other newspapers have reported on this as well. It continues to be a problem. What can we do, both in countries like the Philippines, to try to ensure that these women are not lured in under false pretenses, in South Korea, which obviously has done a fine job with its own legislation and its own policy, and our own armed forces there to make sure that this issue ends?
Well, I do think that, as you said, the legislative framework in South Korea is certainly adequate for this. It's only been now a few months in which we've had the new anti-trafficking law, and I think that's something that, again, as with some of these other countries that have new laws, we're hoping that will end up having a good effect on some of these situations. Frankly, the 2004 anti-trafficking law was cumbersome. It wasn't really something that was as useful as a number of the modern anti-trafficking laws around the world. And while I haven't specifically had a chance to talk to our South Korean counterparts about is that one of the things that was getting in the way of prosecuting the juicy bars, I do know that was getting in the way of prosecuting all of the forms of both sex trafficking and labor trafficking. And so it's something that we think will have a kind of a lifts all boats type of an effect on this area of the economy as well. I think we all look at the last 10 years as far as U.S. Armed Forces Korea and trying to clean up some of the situations there as a success. It seems as though, however, the more overt nature of the sex industry that we saw at the beginning of the last decade with easily exposed child prostitution and other things just by having folks with hidden cameras walking down the street, that those things have now kind of passed from the stage. And so we see that notion of the juicy bars, for instance, as being something that is more difficult to investigate and prosecute, because you have to really peel back what's going on. It's not the overt brothel type of situation that we saw in the past. But it's something that as we work with our Korean counterparts, we've seen a lot of intensive engagement on their part in the last year, very encouraging. And I think that with this new law, hopefully that'll provide the tools that are necessary to go out and investigate these cases.
Let me ask you with regards to the Roma, which most people in America are probably unfamiliar with, but they are the largest, most discriminated group in all of Europe. But there was a report done by the European Roma Rights Center. As a matter of fact, I actually offered a resolution at the Parliamentary Assembly focusing on the Roma and the disproportionality of how many Roma women are trafficked into sex trafficking. And I'm wondering what our country is doing, while Roma are not a problem here in any large numbers, to encourage our European friends, whether it be in Romania or in any other nations where they are trafficked, to really take a serious effort to enfranchise the Roma, to work on education opportunities, job opportunities, to go after the systemic problems that lead to the trafficking and the statelessness that they so often suffer from.
Indeed, I think that
I'll go to you next.
some of the broader issues that you raise with the Roma are things that our counterparts in the Bureau of Democracy, Rights, and Labor deal with more directly. But for our part in the trafficking office, the Roma are always on the agenda when we're dealing with the European countries. I think that we've seen, as a result of that, especially the uptick in cases being done to protect the children that are in the child begging situation. 5 years ago, you'd see, even after I started as Ambassador at Large, you'd have those conversations with our European counterparts, and the response was, those are a bunch of little criminals, or, oh, well, that's just, a child protection type of situation, that they should be in school rather than out begging. Now we've seen, I think, especially in the last 2 years, a recognition on the part of a number of European governments in the ways that matter, by arresting the gang leaders and helping the children, that the children, the Roma children in the begging rings are not little criminals, they're actually victims. And I think that that's something that anything that we can do to make that more of a compassionate rather than an immediate rejection on the part of Western European law enforcement towards Roma community opens up that space in which they can treat the Roma with the respect and dignity that we're looking for on our broader human rights response to Roma issues.
Go ahead. Ms. Bass?
Just switching subjects a little bit, there's this case of a Nigerian woman who was in a European country who cooperated. She was a sex trafficking victim. She cooperated, she testified, the trafficking folks were put in prison, and then they decided to deport her. And my question to you is, what are we doing? I mean, I know we have those cases here occasionally, but what are we doing with other countries? What country was it? It was Denmark. Are we working with other countries to get them to, and for this specific case, which is one that's going on now, I don't know if there's a way for us to.
Well, I think one of the things that, as we look at this situation, what you described was, unfortunately, especially after the 1996 Immigration Reform Act became the norm for a few years, because we didn't have a way to keep trafficking victims in the United States. There was 1 year where I think when I was a prosecutor, I used the full allotment of the visas that were created by Congress for people who flipped against their organized crime counterparts. I just went out and used them for trafficking victims because nobody told me not to. And I think that what we see in the European context is that that ability to freelance a little bit that we see on the part of innovative law enforcement folks here in the U.S. is not kind of within the cultural DNA of European law enforcement. It's very much, you only do something if there is a law that authorizes you to do it, and then you apply the other law. So there's kind of two systems of law, authorizing and otherwise. What we see in the European context, I think, though, is that starting with the Italians in 1998 and then kind of moving across Europe, that notion that trafficking victims should not be jailed and deported. It starts off with the idea of a reflection period, time to stabilize, time to be able to have social services. But then on the back end, that notion that you should have the opportunity to stay in the country and work and be a productive member of the society that you had tried to go to, but then were abused in. And I think that that's something that, as we look at the European context, the European directive, which is their piece of legislation on trafficking that is now applies to the entire European Union, it has in it that notion of non-deportation-based remedies for the trafficking victims. It's the one reservation, as I understand it, that the Danes, when they signed the European directive, they actually reserved that. And so they chose to not be governed by that provision. We've seen the effect of Article 4 of the European directive, even just in the last few weeks, when the High Court in London issued an order saying that the children who were being found in drug manufacturing factories in Britain could not be deported, could not be jailed and deported because they were victims. That's certainly the type of response that we'd like to see on the part of Denmark. It's the type of response that the rest of Europe seems to be moving towards organically, and we hope that as colleagues, as folks who have a good human rights background on other issues, and folks who want to be with the rest of us on kind of the cutting edge of victim care, that we can prevail upon our friends in Denmark to look at the situations like the one that you describe, perhaps from a different angle. We've got a new ambassador going out this fall, and I think it's something that hopefully we'll be able to talk with him about what the priorities could be. Thank you, Ms. Bass.
Just a few final questions. We have another vote. On the Demek case, again, I was just in Istanbul and did a side meeting with the lawyer for the two of the exploited boys by the former Justice Minister Demek from the Netherlands. The newest information is that he was there, according to the Turkish government, in 1996. He had denied that he was there. And I'm wondering, I know you had looked into it when you two were in Turkey, if you might be able to shed some light on that case. And if you could speak to Egypt. I've actually chaired 3 hearings, and I'm so frustrated that we haven't been able to get any kind of traction with the administration. And I don't mean you, but with Ambassador Patterson or with the DRL office on the forced abduction of top Coptic Christian girls who are then forced into Islamic marriages, and they can never go back, because if they go back, they're accused of apostasy and subjected to a horrible potential fate. And yet, you know, Michelle Clark, the former number 2 at the ODIHR office for the OSCE, worked on trafficking, investigated it herself, and said that this is a very serious problem, and it has gotten worse under the Morsi regime, although he's not there now, but it did get worse during his time in office. And I'm wondering if you might shed some light on that terrible cruelty of again, abducting children and then forcing them into marriages in Egypt.
One of the things that we've seen with, especially in the Egyptian context, in the forced marriages, and the thing I think that there's been more widespread reporting on is the other half of that, the abduction and sale of girls for what's been called the summer marriages. It's something that we've seen as an ongoing problem. It's something that we're starting to be able to get our hands around. As far as the forced abduction of Coptic girls, whether that's forced abduction for the bringing in of marriages or for conversion, it's something that we continue to look at. I think that you're correct, Mr. Smith, that the notion of the changes in the government have made it harder to have our hands around. One last thing, and just for the record, with Mr. Smith having left, it's good to hear that there's some new information on the Demek situation coming out of the chairman's trip to Turkey, and it's something that we'll certainly be wanting to follow up with as far as making sure that we have the most current information about what your steps to investigate that case are, so that we're able to inform ourselves in our discussions with the folks over in the Netherlands and in the Turkish government. So it's something that we'll follow up on with staff as well.
Well, I thank you, and the chairman stepping out for votes. This has been one of those days where nothing goes according to plan, so I appreciate your flexibility. But if you could perhaps share a little bit about the encouragements or discouragements with regards to Russia and Uzbekistan, you know, what are some of the things that we need to look at or highlight and help with you to work on?
Well, I think that one of the things that we've seen this last year with Russia, as part of the, obviously we've got the 6 countries that were facing the auto-downgrade provisions of the TVPA. So that was Iraq, Azerbaijan, Congo, Brazzaville, Russia, China, and Uzbekistan. I think it's illustrative when you're looking at the 3 countries that ended up going down to look at the countries that went up, because it's kind of the, by looking at the negative, we can see what could have happened. Even a country with as little capacity as Congo, Brazzaville, able to investigate and bring prosecutions for the first time. Iraq being able to pass anti-trafficking legislation, sending people into the women's prisons to sort folks out who had been arrested for prostitution offenses and identifying a handful of women to let out of prison, saying these were actually victims rather than perpetrators. Azerbaijan doing the first cases against people who were holding men in forced labor in the construction industry. All of those countries then being able to look at them and bring them up to Tier 2 on the report. If you compare that then to Russia, Uzbekistan, and also China, especially I think in the Russian context, you've got a country that is in a different trajectory, a situation where while there are some sex trafficking prosecutions that were being done, and there's some very good folks both at the health ministry and even some of the police guys who are out there doing the cases, systemically we don't see the creation, even under their own action plan, the Commonwealth of Independent States action plan. Most of the other signatories to the CIS action plan have gone out and brought together the kind of interagency working group that plan calls for. The Russian Federation has not. Victim care, shelters closing for lack of government funding as opposed to opening. So it's just a different trajectory than we saw with some of the other countries that were on that Tier 2 watch list, auto downgrade 6. In Uzbekistan, again, there's some things that were done, especially around sex trafficking cases, which were laudable, but they are eclipsed by the notion of the cotton harvest and all of the problems with the state enforcing the labor of its citizens out into that annual exercise without bringing in the folks from the international community and others to really look at whether or not that practice was being brought to an end. So I think that we've seen in both Russia and Uzbekistan the need for continued support from not just having the State Department out there talking about this, but we see the Europeans, we see even the business community talking to Uzbekistan. This is not simply the tip office going to Uzbekistan. It's properly our partners around the world, our partners in the interagency, and you here in Congress as well. So I think it's that kind of the big voice that all of us speaking together can take out into the world. And I think it's starting to have an effect in some of these countries.
Well, do you see some of this, is there any correlation with regards to demographics in terms of a younger population? Is that something that will exacerbate the problem? Are you looking at that correlation or not?
Well, I do think that we have some concerns, and it's concerns that when we were working with the Russians on the U.S.-Russia Presidential Bilateral Commission under President Medvedev and President Obama, it was something that very much in the work of my subcommittee, which was looking at migration and issues as well as human trafficking, that notion of a population in Russia that is kind of emptying out, the notion of a country that's so far below replacement rate, where are the factory workers coming from? Increasingly, they're coming from Vietnam. And it was interesting to be in a garment factory east of Moscow, where there was actually a mixed group, and to see Vietnamese workers who had learned Russian and were working side by side with their Russian counterparts. That would be, I think, a model of how you have a guest worker situation, as opposed to all Vietnamese factories with guards and exploitation, and then Russians who would be looking for a job in their own hometown and not being able to get a job down at the garment factory. So we saw one of the good factories when we were there as part of the bilateral commission. But you could tell from talking to our Russian counterparts and others that the demographic shifts in Russia, the weakening of the next generation is of great concern.
So you can see the problem potentially getting worse from a human trafficking standpoint, because I know in this room we've heard testimony with Vietnam in particular in terms of what we've seen with just the trafficking of girls and men, but to Russia with a really systemic problem from just the magnitude of what it is. And so do you see that continuing to get worse without a concentrated effort to curtail it?
Well, I think that one of the things that we've seen in the Russian context is that notion of an economy that still wants to grow very much, and especially in the building trades, both from Vietnam and from Central Asia. The notion of just how powerful of a magnet the Russian economy is for foreign guest workers. So it's a Vietnamese problem, but it's also a Kyrgyz problem, an Uzbek problem, a Tajik problem. The estimates that were reflected in the report this year from some of the academics in Russia are that there are upward of 1 million people being held in forced labor in Russia. This is a country of about 140 million people. This is not a country of 350 million, or this is not in India or China where you're talking in billions.
Right.
So the notion that that high of a percentage already within their workforce is in these circumstances indicative of forced labor, I think is a real warning shot for everyone.
Well, and you mentioned earlier about IDing, and I know that we've ID'd, I guess, some 40,000 victims of human trafficking, and yet the problem is probably a 27 million, according to your testimony, I think 27 million people involved in it. How do we do a better job of identifying those victims? Because when we do identify those and we can apply pressures, either diplomatically or through one-on-one exchange, how do we do a better job of identifying that? Is that a resource problem? Is that a strategic problem? You've got, as you mentioned, 60 people within your organization that I would assume have a heart for these victims, and I recognize that. And what I'm saying is I want to give you the tools to make sure that we just don't have these hearings that continue to go on and we turn the other way. If I've got to, if members of the Congress have to be the heavy, we're willing to do that, I think, because of this. We understand that you're in a tough situation, but I want to take the compassionate heart of your 60 employees and say, how do we give you the tools to identify the victims, and then make sure that we take the appropriate actions, put some teeth to the TIP report?
I think that in many ways, Mr. Meadows, the situation often comes down to not just the structures, not just the resources, et cetera, but it comes down to political will. That notion of, if you've got the head of a ministry or the head of a government who really wants to see numbers of victims who've been helped, then typically the bureaucracy will respond to that in a positive way. And if they don't, it's not going to happen. It's something that about 1.5 years ago, when we were in the process of the changing relationship with Burma, about 3 weeks or so after Secretary Clinton was there, I was able to go in to Rangoon, and I met with Aung San Suu Kyi in the house where she had been held for so many years. And she had a copy of the training manual for the Burmese police. And they've got a pretty good little anti-trafficking unit, even before we opened up the relationship. And she asked the most important and most inconvenient question that anybody could ask about that training manual. She said, of the 84 people that went to that training last month, were any of them now being assigned to work on human trafficking cases?
Wow.
And I think that to me, really, it showed me kind of what's that next question. We don't always ask. You know, we look at, whether it's in state or USAID, we'll often be monitoring, well, how many people were trained? How much, training materials did we get out? Did we get a new good curriculum? How many laws have been passed around the world? And those are all very important, but then that question that Aung San Suu Kyi asked is the one that can undo all of those other data. And when we come to you, whether it's in a report like this or telling you, how we're spending the money that you guys are able to appropriate to us, we're often not able to answer that last question. And to me, that's one of, I think, the most important things, so that the work of not just my 60 people, but all of the people around the world who want to work on human trafficking is meaningful. I think that's probably, if I had to say the one thing that's the key, it's not simply providing the training, providing the technical assistance, all of the things that we can and do, but then providing the expectation. Now that we've trained you, are you going to be able to go out and do it? Maybe you call that mentoring, maybe you call that follow-up. I'm not, monitoring and evaluation. There's a lot of things you can call it, but at the end of the day, we're looking at what are the results that we can tie back to the training that we're able to provide. And I think that when we're able to answer that question better, we're not going to be stuck at 47,000 victims.
Right. Let me ask one other question, then I'll yield back to the chairman as he's come back. When we look at sanctions, when we look at enforcement, what I have found, because we have a unique position of bipartisan support with a strong leader like Chairman Smith who is willing to articulate it, even in times when it creates a very uncomfortable situation with people from either ambassadors or people in leadership of other countries. But we have a bipartisan support that will not only talk about sanctions, but will go to action. And without naming names, the chairman had mentioned about a sanction on a particular country and about putting forth some legislation to support that and resolutions to support it. It got the attention, as it should, because it was not a bluff. It should have gotten the attention, but it got the attention of that particular nation. And because of that, we've got a meeting coming up that will start to address some of the human rights violations in this particular country. Can we do that in working with the State Department in a more effective way where it's, again, not the words of somebody with a mic on a hearing, but it is really the actions that are backed up by that? Do you think that would be helpful?
Well, I think that type of engagement is always helpful. I think that the details of any particular, whether it's a sanctions package or whether it's a particular diplomatic approach, we have to look at the context in the particular government. But I think that notion of lashing up as much as we can, and more than we have been doing. I realized the other day when I was talking to my staff that we've been so busy on a lot of these things that we haven't necessarily been suggesting or supporting congressional travel, and so a lot of members have not been to the shelter. They haven't met with the anti-trafficking police unit out there, and it's something that we know that we need to step up so that you guys can see that when you're on the road, whether it's part of a previously scheduled trip or something specific to this. I use that only as an example of that notion that we need to perhaps look at how we're doing this and how that lashes up with the work of the committee and the work of the individual members, so that we can make sure, especially in a time of shrinking budgets and challenges around the resources that we have, that we're making up for those things by having not just the 60 people in my office, but 535 others and their staff who can go out and help get this message out around the world.
Well, if you would take the message back to your staff and to all of those that are there, that we appreciate the effort that they're putting forth on behalf of this unbelievable just blight on our world, and with that we appreciate it. It's very easy when you look at 27 million people to start looking at them as numbers that are too big to handle. But every little girl that is trafficked is someone, they have a dad and they have a mom that cares individually about that person. We've heard just unbelievable testimony in this where parents have talked about their children, where people have been sold into slavery as wives twice, and it just breaks my heart. And so there's a tendency to look at it as big numbers. I want to say that every single one of those is an individual case, and I want to encourage those that to not look at budget cutbacks and anything else as an indictment on their work. It's a sign of the times, but that we're willing to work with you in a real way to make a real difference. I yield back to the chairman, and I thank him for his work.
Thank you very much, Mr. Meadows, and thank you, Ambassador Cidabaco, for your testimony, your leadership. If there's anything you'd like to say before we close.
The one last thing I would like to say, Mr. Smith, is, if you look at this year's report, there's a lot of ways that people read the report. The first day, a lot of the people from the press, they read it for ups and downs and, what the horse race aspects of it are. A lot of folks then will read it just as, what does it say about the country that I'm from or the country that I care about, et cetera. The reason that victim identification as a theme of the report this year, I think, has had some resonance. If you look at the introduction of the report, it really sets out that notion of kind of what is victim identification, what is best practices, et cetera. And I think it all flows back to this point that Mr. Meadows just made, that notion that every one of these is a person. We're doing this because people are being enslaved. We all have to work on big, important issues that are more kind of policy issues where we're dealing with the ebb and flow of international commerce or geopolitics or things like that. But at its heart, human trafficking is evil because individual people are being victimized. And that's something that I think that this committee and you through your leadership, but I think everyone in the U.S. government has come to realize. And so it should be no surprise when folks look at the last page of the report, the note from my staff, that what we focus on is that notion of the victim. There's many ways to read this report, but what we hope that people take away are not the tragedies that are in it, but on that last page, the picture of those 9 or 10 victims who have now become survivors, who have become advocates. It shouldn't be their tears that we think about or that we say that defines them. It should be their smiles and their determination, because they know that that they have a voice and that this is a room where it can be heard.
On that, thank you very, very much. The hearing is adjourned.